Hi, I'm Max Dawson. Thank you for watching this video about the Bible. We've been learning that the Bible is not a bunch of disconnected stories, but rather that there is one story that runs through the whole Bible. We've seen the three promises made to Abraham in Genesis 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. There we find a land promise, a nation promise, and a blessing or seed promise to Abraham. We've looked at the Bible story as it's presented to us in the first 6 books of the Bible, from Genesis to Joshua. And there we've seen how God built a great nation from the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God built the nation of Israel. And while Israel found themselves enslaved in Egypt, God delivered them from Egypt by the hand of Moses. Moses led Israel through the Red Sea and onward to Mount Sinai, where God gave them his law. Following the death of Moses, it was Joshua who led the people of Israel into the promised land of Canaan. The first 2 promises then, the land promise and the nation promise, had been fulfilled. Promise number 3 is now the focus of our attention. The promise that God would bless all nations through Abraham's seed. This is a promise that extends beyond Israel. It is a blessing for all nations. Yet God's dealings are focused on one nation, for through one nation, Israel, God would bring the Savior to bless all nations. Actually, all of the Old Testament after Joshua is preparation for the seed promise. The book of Joshua is the history of God giving the land to the nation of Israel. Following Joshua are 11 more books of history, from Judges to Esther, covering about 1,000 years of Israel's history. Everything in these 11 books of history is leading up to the coming of the Christ, the one who would fulfill the seed promise. Let me give you a quick overview of that period of history. It can be divided into 6 sections. First, there is the period of the Judges, beginning about 1,400 years before Christ came. This period lasted for more than 400 years. God governed the nation by judges. This was not a good period for God's people, as they were often stubborn and disobedient. God could have destroyed the disobedient nation, but he did not because of the seed promised to Abraham. Next, there is the period of the United Kingdom. The people complained that they did not have kings like all the other nations. God gave them 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. This is called the United Kingdom because the nation was unified at this time. The time is about 1,000 years before the coming of Christ. But following Solomon's death, the kingdom was divided. So then we have the divided kingdom. God's people were divided into 2 nations. The nation in the north continued to wear the name Israel. The nation in the south was called Judah, after the predominant tribe in the south. The kingdom was divided about 900 years before the coming of Christ. Next we have the period of the Assyrian captivity. The northern kingdom of Israel was taken captive by Assyria about 720 years before Christ came. Israel's captivity was punishment from God for their idolatry. Then we have the Babylonian captivity. The southern kingdom of Judah also fell prey to idolatry. About 600 years before Jesus came, this nation was carried away captive by the Babylonians. Finally, after 70 years of captivity, the Jewish people were allowed to return to their own land. They rebuilt the city of Jerusalem and also rebuilt the temple that served as their place of worship. God's people were now back in their own land, waiting for the final promise to Abraham to come to pass, the seed promise that would bless all nations. We've just covered about 1,000 years of history of the nation of Israel and the land God gave them. It's now about 400 BC. There were no more Old Testament books written after this time. Everything is just waiting for the time to be right, the time for the 3rd promise to be fulfilled. The book of Matthew in the New Testament opens with the birth of Jesus, the long-awaited seed of Abraham. The things that transpire in the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus all happen in order that promise number 3 can be fulfilled. Jesus is the seed of Abraham. His coming into the world meant that all nations could be blessed, just as God had said in Genesis 12:3. We will see more about Jesus in our upcoming sessions.